Hi, welcome back to Food Science. We are here for our first episode post-holiday hiatus where we will be detoxing a little bit from the indulgent sugary desserts that we all got to have over the holiday season, and we'll be doing chips on chips on chips.
Today for you, we're going to be making 4 different kinds of chips, 2 different potato chips, and 2 different veggie chips, so get hyped. So today, as we mentioned, we are doing a few different kinds of chips, and the purpose of this episode is to sort of look at different kinds of things we can start with to make chips from, which is why we're doing 2 different kinds of potatoes and then 2 different kinds of veggies, and understanding the different properties of those sort of starting materials that then require us to treat them in different ways in order to achieve the same result, which is a nice crispy chip.
Right, so the first chip that we're going to be showing you is a pretty standard russet potato chip. So we are using 3 russet potatoes. You're going to slice them to 1/8 of an inch thickness. So this task is made infinitely easier if you have a mandolin. You can also do it by hand, though. With a knife, you just have to try to keep them consistent. And so while I slice these, Rachel's going to be explaining the science side of what is happening when we fry potato chips.
Yes, I am. So there are 3 different components of potatoes that cause them to, turn into chips. The first component that I'm going to talk about is actually something that is applicable to all potatoes, which is the fact that potatoes contain something called tyrosinase, which is an enzyme for the amino acid tyrosine, which is important for producing proteins in any cell, human or potato. And what this does is once you cut potatoes and expose that white, it's actually the component that causes potatoes to turn brown. So the way you can prevent this is after you finish cutting potatoes, we're going to be rinsing them in cold water. And this will rinse off the tyrosinase and keep our potatoes from turning brown prematurely. The second component of potatoes that makes especially russet potatoes the best choice for chips is that they have a lot of starch in them. So they have a very high starch content, and what starch does when it's heated in hot oil, as we will be doing when we fry them, is it actually swells up and starts to separate a little bit. And this swelling up helps to maintain sort of the kind of, they describe it as fluffiness on the inside of potatoes while getting the outside nice and crispy. The other thing that it does is that when those components of starch start to separate, it actually helps the water in the potato to escape a lot faster. And so that means we can cook it at this super high hot temperature and the water will have enough time to escape and you'll get nice crispy chips. Now, the last thing about potatoes is that it also has this component called pectin, which is actually a structural component to most plant cells. It's in the cell wall. It helps maintain its shape. And it actually breaks down when you cook any vegetable, and this is what causes a lot of browning. So in order to prevent your chip from browning too much prematurely, you can add an acid component to sort of the mix. And this acid component will break down the pectin, and then when you fry the potatoes, they will still be sort of nice and creamy colored without getting too burnt or crispy while you cook them.
Right, and so the same thing that makes potatoes brown actually is what makes apples brown. Mm-hmm. And so similarly, if you don't want an apple to brown after you've cut it, you can add some sort of acid to it, like lime juice, lemon juice, something like that, and it'll keep it from browning.
Mm-hmm. So, did you want to tell them exactly how we're going to be cooking our potatoes today?
Right, so after we slice these, we're going to soak them in water. That'll rinse some of that excess starch off. And then we'll be parboiling them in a mixture of water and then vinegar and salt, 2 tablespoons of each. And then after that, we'll be frying them in peanut oil.
The third component of potatoes to keep in mind when making potato chips is the pectin. Now, all pectin is a component of any plant cell. It's actually in the cell wall and helps plant cells to maintain their structure. And so, likewise, it helps potatoes to, I said potatoes are weird.
Potatoes.
It helps potatoes maintain their structure as well. Now, normally when you cook them, they actually start to break down the structure. The heat, obviously, hot things are not good for...
Hot things are hot.
Hot things are hot, and so they would break down the structure. But by adding an acid component to sort of your procedure of making chips, you can actually slow down the breakdown process, and this will allow the chips to get crispy without burning, and they also help them to hold their structure a little bit better.
Next up is our sweet potato chip. So my mandolin is set to 1/8 of an inch, and while I slice all of the sweet potatoes up, Rachel is going to give you some science facts about sweet potatoes.
All right, so the major difference between sweet potatoes in comparison to other potatoes is the amount of starch and the amount of water. So sweet potatoes actually have a lower starch content than most potatoes, and they have a much higher water content. Now, the lower starch content, the way that affects it, it means that it's a little bit less structured than regular potatoes, and it also means that there'll be less of that sort of swelling and spreading that happens in high starch potatoes, which means it's a lot harder for any water that's in the sweet potatoes to escape. If you fry sweet potatoes, what often happens is that you'll cook the sweet potato before all the water gets a chance to escape, and that usually results in very burnt but still somehow very floppy fries.
So to avoid that utter disappointment of chip, what you're gonna do instead is cook the sweet potatoes on a low temperature for a long time. So we call it low and slow. We are using the lowest setting that our oven has, which is I think 260 degrees. You can feel free to do it a little bit lower if you'd like. What this is going to do is allow all the water to escape from the sweet potatoes before they start to burn, and then you will end up with delicious, crisp, and crunchy chips instead of sad and floppy ones. Now that we've sliced all of the sweet potatoes to a lovely uniform thickness, Rachel is going to toss them with some olive oil and salt and then lay them flat on a baking sheet that has some parchment paper on it, while I do the same to our zucchini, although they will be set at 1/16 of an inch.
While she's slicing the zucchini, I'll talk to you a little bit about what's different about zucchini chips. So they have basically the same problem that sweet potato chips have, which is that they have a very low starch content because it's zucchini and not a potato, and they have a very, very high water content. And so we're going to do the same exact approach in terms of cooking them that we do with sweet potatoes, which is the low and slow, so very low oven temperature for about 2 hours, very long period of time. But we also do a couple other things to try and eliminate the water content. The first is that we slice them very, very thin, and this increases the surface area to the ratio of water, which gives more opportunity for the water to escape or evaporate from the zucchini. The second way is we're actually going to dry them out with some paper towels before we lay them out, to take even more water away if we possibly can. And the last thing that we do is we're going to salt them slightly because the addition of that salt will help to draw out some of the water as well.
Yes. Now Rachel says slightly. That's important because since the zucchini are going to shrink to about half their size in the oven, you don't want to coat them in a bunch of salt, or you'll just get punched in the face with it when you try to eat them.
Exactly.
It just wouldn't be pleasant. Same thing goes for oil. That's why we're using a cooking spray for this, so you don't overcoat it and oversaturate something that is so thin and so delicate. Now to make our kale chips, we will massage 1 tablespoon of coconut oil into the already dried kale, and then as I do this, Rachel's going to explain the science behind how to make kale chips.
So kale chips, our last chips of the day. The major difference with kale in comparison to the previous chips is it has also a very high water content. It's also very thin, and so its comparison of surface area to internal area is very high. Because of this, it releases water very quickly when it's being baked, and so unlike the previous chips in which we needed super hot temperature like oil or a very low temperature for a long period of time, they'll cook very quickly.
Right, and so if you were to fry them like we do the russet potato chips, you would end up running the risk of getting a chip that's really burnt and crispy because the water gets released too quickly when it's at a really high temperature.
It'd also shrivel up and not really hold its structure very well either, and so baking them is a way to let them sort of maintain their shape and yet get nice and crispy like chips. Episode of Food Science. We hope you enjoyed all the chips as much as we did.
And as always, please remember to like us on Facebook, follow us on Twitter, And subscribe to our YouTube channel for more videos. Thanks, and we'll see you guys in 2 weeks.
Bye!